The morning fog was thick that October day, the kind that makes everything look like it's wrapped in cotton. Margaret had been walking this same route for the past 15 years, ever since her husband passed away. Every morning at 6:30, rain or shine, she'd put on her walking shoes and make her way down County Road 12. It wasn't much to look at, just an old two-lane road that connected the small town of Millbrook to the highway. But it was quiet, peaceful, and gave her time to think. At 78 years old, Margaret wasn't as spry as she used to be. Her knees complained with every step, especially on cold mornings like this one. But she kept walking anyway. The doctor said it was good for her heart, and besides, what else was she going to do? Sit at home and watch the morning news tell her how awful the world was getting. She was about half a mile from her house when she heard it. A low, pained groan coming from somewhere off to her right. Margaret stopped walking and listened carefully. There it was again. Someone was hurt now. Most folks her age might have kept walking, might have thought twice about investigating strange noises in the fog. But Margaret had been a nurse for 40 years before she retired, and some instincts just don't go away. She carefully made her way to the edge of the road. Peering down into the ditch below, what she saw made her heart skip a beat. 2 motorcycles were crumpled at the bottom of the embankment, their chrome twisted and their paint scraped off in long streaks. And near them, barely visible through the fog, were 2 men in black leather jackets. One was lying completely still, pinned partially under one of the bikes. The other was moving slightly, trying to reach for something, but he couldn't seem to get his body to cooperate. Margaret didn't waste time thinking about how steep the ditch was or how her knees were going to hate her for this. She found the least steep spot and started making her way down, using small trees and bushes to steady herself. Twice, she almost slipped, but she managed to reach the bottom without falling. Up close, she could see just how bad things were. The younger man, who looked to be in his late 20s, had blood streaming down the side of his face from a deep gash on his forehead. His right leg was bent at an angle that made Margaret's stomach turn. She'd seen enough broken bones in her nursing days to know a bad fracture when she saw one. The older one looked even worse. He was conscious, but barely, his breathing shallow and rapid. Margaret could see the way he was cradling his left side, and she knew immediately that he probably had broken ribs, maybe worse. He needed to stay still, but the motorcycle was pressing down on his lower body. He was struggling weakly against it. That's when Margaret noticed the patches on their jackets. Big, unmistakable patches that read Hell's Angels across the back, with the winged skull logo that everyone knew. These weren't just any motorcyclists. These were the kind of men that made people lock their doors and cross to the other side of the street. For just a second, she thought about 3 years ago when a group of bikers had rolled through Millbrook and gotten into a fight at Murphy's Bar. The whole town had been on edge for weeks afterward. The sheriff had made it very clear that motorcycle clubs weren't welcome in their little town, but then the younger man's eyes fluttered open and he looked right at her. His pupils were different sizes, which told Margaret he probably had a concussion on top of everything else. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a whisper. "Please," he managed to say. "My little girl. She's only 6. Please." And just like that, Margaret wasn't looking at a Hell's Angel anymore. She was looking at a father who was terrified he might never see his daughter again. She was looking at someone's son, someone who mattered to somebody. Lying in a ditch and bleeding and scared, Margaret pulled out her cell phone. But her nurse's brain was already working through the situation. The ambulance would have to come from the county hospital, 20 minutes away at least. These men might not have 20 minutes. The younger one was losing blood fast, and the older one's breathing was getting worse by the second. She made a decision that would change everything. Instead of calling 911 right away, Margaret dialed her son-in-law, Robert. He lived just down the road, maybe 2 minutes away if he drove fast. She needed help now, not in 20 minutes. "Robert, I need you to grab every blanket you can find and my first aid kit from the garage. Bring your truck and get to County Road 12, about half a mile past Miller's farm. Don't ask questions, just hurry." She could hear the confusion in his voice, but he agreed. Then Margaret did what she could with what she had. She took off her own coat, ignoring the cold October air that immediately bit through her sweater, and laid it over the younger man's chest. He was shivering badly, and she knew shock was setting in. "Stay with me, honey," she said, using the same gentle voice she'd used with countless patients over the years. "Help is coming. Tell me about your daughter. What's her name?" The man's eyes focused on her a little better. "Lily," he whispered. "She's 6. First grade. Loves butterflies." "That's good. That's real good. You keep thinking about Lily, okay? You're going to see her again. I promise you that." Margaret had no business making promises like that. But sometimes people needed to hear something to hold on to. She moved to the older man next. His eyes were closed, but he was still breathing. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm a retired nurse. I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay as still as possible. Can you do that for me?" His eyes opened slightly, and he gave the tiniest nod. Margaret could see the pain written all over his face, but she also saw something else. Gratitude. The sound of Robert's truck pulling up on the road. Above was the most beautiful thing Margaret had heard all morning. She heard his footsteps as he made his way down the embankment, heard the moment when he stopped dead in his tracks. "Mom, are you serious right now?" Robert's voice was tight. "Do you know who these guys are?" Margaret looked up at her son-in-law, a man she'd known for 20 years, a good man who'd never let her down. "I know they're bleeding and scared and somebody's sons, Robert. Now are you going to help me, or are you going to stand there?" For a long moment, Robert just stared at her. Then he let out a long breath and climbed the rest of the way down. "You're going to give Dad a heart attack if he was still alive," he muttered, but he was already unfolding blankets. Together, they worked as fast as they safely could. Margaret used her scarf to make a tourniquet for the younger man's leg wound, tying it just tight enough to slow the bleeding but not cut off circulation completely. Robert helped her carefully shift the motorcycle off the older man, moving it just enough to take the pressure off without jostling him too much, only when both men were as stable as she could make them. Covered with blankets and with their wounds temporarily treated, did Margaret finally dial 9-1-1 as she gave the operator their location? She looked at the 2 men lying in the ditch. In a few minutes, the ambulance would arrive. The sheriff would probably show up too. And then the whole town would know what she'd done. Margaret had a feeling her morning walks were about to get a lot more interesting. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, sirens wailing through the foggy morning air. Right behind it came Sheriff Bradley's patrol car, lights flashing red and blue against the white mist. Margaret was still kneeling beside the younger biker when the paramedics scrambled down the embankment with their equipment. "We've got it from here," one of the paramedics said gently. But his eyes widened when he saw the Hells Angels patches. He glanced up at his partner, and something unspoken passed between them. Margaret stood up slowly, her knees screaming in protest after kneeling on the cold ground for so long. Robert helped steady her as they watched the paramedics work. They were professionals and they did their jobs without hesitation, but Margaret could see the tension in their shoulders. Everyone knew what those patches meant. Sheriff Bradley was a different story. He came down that embankment like a man on a mission, his jaw set tight and his hand resting on his belt near his radio. Tom Bradley had been the sheriff of Millbrook for nearly 20 years, and he ran a tight ship. He was a good man, fair but firm. And he'd made it very clear after the incident at Murphy's bar that motorcycle clubs weren't welcome in his town. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that special tone people use when they're trying very hard to stay calm. "Want to tell me what happened here?" "2 motorcyclists hit a deer, from the looks of it," Margaret replied, pointing to the dead deer lying about 20 feet away in the brush. "Lost control and went down into the ditch. I found them when I was on my morning walk." The sheriff's eyes moved from the deer to the motorcycles to the 2 injured men being loaded onto stretchers. "And you decided to come down here and help them yourself? Before calling us?" "I called Robert first because they needed immediate attention. Then I called 911. Those boys would have bled out if I'd waited the full 20 minutes for the ambulance to arrive." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I did what needed to be done, Tom." Sheriff Bradley sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Margaret, do you understand who these men are? Do you see those patches? Hells Angels aren't just some motorcycle club. They're somebody's sons," Margaret interrupted. "And that young one down there is somebody's father." He's got a 6-year-old daughter who's going to want her daddy to come home. That may be, but you should have called us first. You don't know these people. They could be dangerous. They could be, he stopped himself, but Margaret knew what he was going to say. Criminals, drug dealers, violent men. Could be dying, Margaret said quietly. And they were. So I helped them. That's what we do in this town, isn't it? We help people. The sheriff didn't have an answer for that. He watched as the paramedics carried the stretchers up to the ambulance. The older biker was unconscious now, which Margaret knew wasn't a good sign. The younger one was still awake, his eyes searching, until they found Margaret. He mouthed something that looked like "thank you" before they loaded him into the ambulance. By the time Margaret and Robert made it back up to the road, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Peterson from the flower shop, old Bill from the hardware store, the Ramirez couple who ran the diner on Main Street. In a town as small as Millbrook, news traveled faster than the internet. Somebody must have heard the sirens and spread the word. Is it true? Mrs. Peterson asked, clutching her purse against her chest. Were they really Hell's Angels? Margaret nodded, too tired to do anything but tell the truth. Yes, they were. And you helped them? This came from Bill, his weathered face creased with confusion and something that might have been disapproval. Yes, I did. The crowd exchanged glances. Nobody said anything directly, but Margaret could feel the shift in the air. It was like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Robert drove her home in silence. When they pulled up to her little white cottage, he finally spoke. Mom, people are going to talk. You know that, right? Let them talk, Margaret said, but her voice was tired. I did the right thing, Robert. I know you did, he said quietly. But that doesn't mean everyone else will see it that way. He was right, of course. By noon, Margaret's phone was ringing off the hook. Her daughter called first, her voice high and worried. Mom, is it true? Did you really help those bikers? Everyone's talking about it. Then came the calls from old friends. Some were concerned. Some were curious. And some, like Eleanor from her book club, were downright cold. I just think you should have been more careful, Margaret. Those people aren't like us. You don't know what they might do now that they know where you live. That one stung more than Margaret wanted to admit. She and Eleanor had been friends for 30 years. By the next day, things got worse. Margaret went to the grocery store like she did every Tuesday morning. She'd barely made it through the automatic doors when she noticed people looking at her differently. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Betty Johnson, who'd chatted with her every week for the past decade, suddenly became very interested in the cereal boxes when Margaret came down her aisle at the checkout counter. Young Danny, who usually bagged her groceries, wouldn't meet her eyes. Have a good day, ma'am, he mumbled, and that was it. No friendly chat about his college classes. No jokes about the weather. Just cold, uncomfortable silence. The following Sunday was even harder. Margaret had been going to First Baptist Church since she moved to Millbrook 40 years ago. She'd taught Sunday school there. She'd organized the church potlucks. She'd been there for births and baptisms and funerals. That church was her second home. But when she walked in that Sunday morning, she could feel every eye in the building on her. She took her usual seat in the third pew on the right, and nobody sat next to her. Not even the Martinez family, who'd been sitting beside her for 5 years. After the service, Pastor Williams pulled her aside. He was a kind man, younger than her by a good 20 years, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Margaret, I need to talk to you about something. I've been getting some calls from congregation members. They are, concerned about what? Margaret asked, though she already knew. About the incident with those bikers. Some folks feel that you put yourself in danger unnecessarily. And now there's worry that you might have drawn unwanted attention to our town. He paused, choosing his words carefully. They're wondering if maybe you should consider apologizing to the community, just to smooth things over. Margaret stared at him for a long moment. Apologize for saving 2 men's lives. I'm not saying I agree with them, Pastor Williams said quickly. I'm just telling you what people are saying. You know how small towns can be? Maybe if you just explained that you didn't realize who they were. Or that you acted impulsively, but I did realize who they were. Margaret interrupted. "I saw those patches clear as day. And I didn't act impulsively. I made a choice, Pastor. A conscious choice to help to human beings who were dying. And I won't apologize for that. Not to you, not to the congregation, not to anybody." The pastor sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that. Were you hoping I'd lie?" Margaret asked, and she couldn't keep the edge out of her voice. "After 40 years in this church, were you hoping I'd stand up there and tell everyone that I didn't know what I was doing? That I'm just a confused old woman who made a mistake? No, of course not. He stopped and shook his head. "You're right. I'm sorry, Margaret. You did the right thing. I know you did. I just wish others could see it that way." "So do I," Margaret said softly. That afternoon, her daughter came over with her husband, Robert. They sat at Margaret's kitchen table, the same table where they'd had countless family dinners over the years, and had the conversation Margaret had been dreading. "Mom, maybe you should leave town for a while," her daughter said, reaching across to hold Margaret's hand. "Just until this all blows over. You could come stay with us or visit Aunt Helen in Florida." "Run away?" Margaret shook her head. "I'm not running away from my own home because I helped 2 injured men." "It's not running away," Robert said gently. "It's just ... giving people time to calm down. You know how folks can be. Right now, emotions are high. In a few weeks, maybe a month, they'll forget all about it."
8.
But Margaret knew better. Small towns didn't forget things like this. Small towns had long memories and even longer grudges. She was now the woman who helped the Hells Angels. That label would follow her around for the rest of her life. What nobody in Millbrook knew yet was that things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. Because at that very moment, in a hospital room 20 miles away, the older biker was regaining consciousness. And the first thing he did was ask about the old woman who'd saved his life. The Hells Angels were about to learn about Margaret. And Margaret was about to learn that sometimes doing the right thing brings consequences nobody could have predicted. 2 weeks had passed since the accident, and Margaret had settled into a new routine. A lonelier routine. Her morning walks continued, but now she went a different direction. Avoiding County Road 12 and the curious stares from passing cars, the grocery store trips became quick in and out missions. Church attendance dropped to every other week, then once a month. It was a crisp Sunday morning when everything changed. Margaret was in her kitchen, making her usual breakfast of toast and tea, when she heard something that made her freeze. The low rumble of motorcycle engines. Multiple motorcycle engines at first. She thought they were just passing through town. But the sound got closer and closer, until it stopped right in front of her house. Margaret's heart began to pound. She moved to her front window and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. At least 20 motorcycles were lined up along her quiet street. Big, chrome-covered machines that gleamed in the morning sunlight. And every single rider wore the same leather vest with the same patch on the back. Hells Angels within seconds. Neighbors started emerging from their houses. Mrs. Chen across the street stood on her porch with her phone already pressed to her ear, no doubt calling the sheriff. Old Walter, 2 doors down, grabbed his walking stick like it was a weapon. Someone's car alarm started blaring. It's probably triggered by the vibration of all those engines. Margaret's phone rang almost immediately. It was Robert. "Mom, don't go outside. I'm calling the police right now. Just stay inside and lock your doors." But Margaret was already watching through her window as one of the bikers dismounted. He was older than the others, maybe in his late 50s, silver hair pulled back in a ponytail and a full beard that was more white than gray. He moved with the kind of authority that made it clear he was in charge. Behind him, 2 more men got off their bikes. One was on crutches, his legs still in a cast. The younger biker from the accident. The other was moving slowly, carefully, being pushed in a wheelchair by another club member. The older biker from the ditch, still recovering but alive. Margaret made a decision. She unlocked her front door and stepped out onto her porch. "Mom, no!" she heard Robert shout through the phone that was still in her hand, but she'd already hung up. The silver-haired man approached her walkway and stopped at the gate. Up close, Margaret could see the deep lines around his eyes. It's the kind that came from years of squinting into the wind on open roads. but his eyes themselves were gentle, almost kind. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Are you Margaret Henderson?" "I am," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. She'd faced down plenty of scary things in her 78 years. She could face this too. "My name's Raymond. My brother is the man you saved. And this here," he gestured to the young man on crutches, "is my nephew. They tell me you pulled them out of that ditch, stopped them from bleeding out. Is that true?" Margaret glanced at her neighbors, who were watching from safe distances. She could see Sheriff Bradley's patrol car racing down the street, lights flashing. "I did what anyone should have done. They needed help." Raymond's weathered face broke into a smile, and there was genuine emotion in his eyes. "See, that's where you're wrong, ma'am. Most folks wouldn't have done what you did. Most folks would have seen these patches and kept right on walking. But you didn't. You climbed down into that ditch with your bad knees, and you saved my family." The younger biker hobbled forward on his crutches. "I remember you," he said, his voice thick. "You told me to think about my daughter. You promised I'd see her again. And you were right. I got to hold her 3 days ago. Because of you." Margaret felt her eyes getting wet. She hadn't let herself cry since this whole thing started. But something about seeing this young father alive and healing broke through her. Defenses. The man in the wheelchair spoke up next, though it clearly hurt him to do so. "The doctor said 10 more minutes, and I wouldn't have made it. My internal bleeding would have been too severe. You gave me those 10 minutes. You gave me a second chance at life." Raymond reached into his jacket, and Margaret saw several of her neighbors gasp and step back. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a folded piece of leather. He handed it to one of the other club members, who carefully unfolded it. It was a leather vest, custom-made with beautiful stitching. On the back was a special patch that read, "Guardian Angel with delicate wings embroidered in silver thread." It was one of the most beautiful things Margaret had ever seen. "This is for you," Raymond said. "You're an honorary member of our family now, and we take care of family." Sheriff Bradley's patrol car screeched to a stop, and he jumped out with 2 deputies. "All right, that's enough. Everyone needs to move along. Now." Raymond didn't even turn around. "We're just paying our respects, Sheriff." "No law against that, is there?" "You're disturbing the peace," Sheriff Bradley said, his hand hovering near his belt. "And you're making this neighborhood uncomfortable? We'll be gone in 5 minutes," Raymond replied calmly. "We just needed to do this properly." He turned back to Margaret. "Ma'am, we've also made a donation in your name. $5,000 to the Children's Literacy Program at the library. Your daughter told us it was your favorite charity." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "You talked to my daughter?" "We called the hospital to find out your name. They called your family to make sure you were okay with us visiting. Your daughter said you'd probably be too stubborn to accept money directly, so we made the donation on your behalf." He smiled. "She knows you pretty well." The younger biker stepped forward again. "There's one more thing. This town is under our protection now. Anybody gives you trouble, anybody makes you feel unsafe, you call this number." He handed her a card with a phone number written on it in neat handwriting. "Day or night, we'll be here." "That's really not necessary," Margaret started to say, but Raymond interrupted her gently. "Yes, it is. You showed us respect when nobody else would. You treated us like human beings when the whole world just sees these patches. That means something to us. That means everything to us." Sheriff Bradley had moved closer now, clearly nervous about how this whole thing was playing out. "Margaret, you don't have to accept anything from these people." But Margaret was looking at the vest in the club member's hands. She was thinking about the young father who got to see his daughter again. She was thinking about the older man in the wheelchair who'd been given a second chance at life. She was thinking about how the whole town had turned their backs on her for simply being kind to strangers. "I'd be honored to accept your gift," Margaret said quietly. The club member stepped forward and helped her slip the vest on over her cardigan. It fit perfectly. The leather was soft and well-made, and it settled on her shoulders like it belonged there. Cameras were out now. Half the neighborhood was recording this on their phones. Margaret could already imagine the videos spreading across social media, the gossip that would fly through town. But for the first time in 2 weeks, she didn't care. Raymond extended his hand and Margaret shook it firmly. "Thank you," he said simply. "From all of us? Thank you for seeing past the leather and the reputation. Thank you for seeing us." "You're welcome," Margaret replied. "And thank you for this. It's beautiful." As promised, within 5 minutes, the Hells Angels had mounted their bikes and started their engines. But before they pulled away, they did something that would become legendary in Millbrook. Every single rider saluted Margaret. A proper, respectful salute held for several long seconds. Then they rode slowly down her street, their engines rumbling like distant thunder, and disappeared around the corner toward the highway. The neighborhood stood in stunned silence. Sheriff Bradley looked like he didn't know whether to arrest someone or just give up and go home. Mrs. Chen was still recording on her phone, her mouth hanging open. Margaret stood on her porch in her new vest, watching them go. She felt lighter somehow, like a weight she'd been carrying had finally lifted. These men, these supposed criminals and troublemakers, had shown her more kindness and gratitude than her own community had in 2 weeks. She turned to go
back inside
and found herself face to face with Eleanor from her book club. Eleanor, who'd called her careless. Eleanor, who'd stopped speaking to her at church. "Margaret," Eleanor said, and her voice was different now, quieter, maybe even impressed. That was really something. Yes, Margaret agreed. It really was. She stepped back into her house, still wearing the vest. Margaret had no idea that the security camera across the street had captured the entire encounter. By that evening, the video would have 10,000 views. By the next morning, it would be on the local news. And by the end of the week, would change everything about how Millbrook saw both Margaret and the Hells Angels. But that was still to come. For now, Margaret made herself a fresh cup of tea and sat in her favorite chair, running her fingers over the beautiful stitching on her vest. "Guardian Angel," it said. She liked the sound of that. The video went viral overnight, not just locally, but nationally. Someone had posted it with the caption, "Hells Angels honor the woman who saved their lives," and by Monday morning it had been shared over 200,000 times. Margaret didn't have social media herself, but her phone wouldn't stop ringing. News stations from 3 states away wanted interviews. A morning talk show in New York called, asking if she'd fly out to be a guest. The mayor's office left 4 messages, asking her to please call back as soon as possible. But the most interesting calls came from people right there in Millbrook. Suddenly, folks who'd been crossing the street to avoid her wanted to hear the whole story. People who'd whispered behind her back were now calling her brave. It was almost funny if it wasn't so frustrating. "They're only calling because the video made them look bad," Margaret told her daughter over coffee that Tuesday morning. "Not because they actually changed their minds about what I did. Does it matter why they changed?" her daughter asked. "Maybe this is a good thing, Mom. Maybe the town is finally coming around." Margaret wanted to believe that. She really did. But 40 years in Millbrook had taught her that people didn't change their minds that easily. The real test came 3 weeks later. On a Wednesday afternoon, Margaret was at home when she heard the sirens. Lots of sirens. She stepped out onto her porch and saw smoke rising from somewhere near the center of town. Black, thick smoke that looked serious. She grabbed her car keys without thinking and drove toward Main Street. When she got there, her heart sank. The elementary school was on fire. Flames were shooting out of the roof near the gymnasium. Firefighters were rushing to connect hoses and get water flowing. Parents were everywhere, screaming, crying, trying to get to their children. Teachers were leading lines of kids out of the building, keeping them calm, even though Margaret could see the fear on the adults' faces. The fire had started during after-school programs, which meant there were still dozens of children inside. Margaret parked her car and ran toward the chaos, her nurse instincts taking over. She found the school principal, Mrs. Davies, coordinating with the fire chief. "How many kids are still inside?" Margaret asked. "I think everyone's out, but we're doing a head count now," Mrs. Davies said, her voice shaking. The fire started in the old heating system. It spread so fast. That's when Margaret heard it. A child crying. Not outside with the others, but from somewhere near the side of the building. She ran toward the sound and found a little boy, maybe 7 years old, pressed against the wall near a window. He was covered in soot and tears were streaming down his face. Honey, what's wrong? Why aren't you with your class? Margaret knelt down beside him. I can't find my sister, he sobbed. She was in the bathroom. I tried to wait for her, but the teacher made me leave. She's still in there. Margaret's blood ran cold. She looked at the building, at the flames licking out of the roof, at the firefighters who were still setting up their equipment. Every second counted. She grabbed the fire chief's arm. There's a little girl still inside. In the bathroom near the east wing, his face went pale. We're not ready to go in yet. The structure isn't safe. We need another 5 minutes too. She might not have 5 minutes, Margaret said urgently. Before anyone could stop her, Margaret ran toward a side entrance that wasn't yet engulfed in flames. She heard people shouting behind her, but she didn't stop. She'd pulled 2 men from a ditch and saved their lives. She could do this too. The smoke inside was thick and choking. Margaret pulled her sweater up over her nose and mouth and stayed low, the way she'd learned in a fire safety course decades ago. The bathroom was down the hall, past 2 classrooms. She could hear crackling above her, could feel the heat pressing down. Hello? She called out, her voice muffled by the fabric. Is anyone here? A small voice answered. Help! I'm scared. Margaret found her in the last stall, a little girl with pigtails who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She was curled up on the floor, coughing from the smoke. Margaret scooped her up, surprised by how light she was, and turned back toward the exit. But the hallway looked different now. More smoke. More flames. The fire had spread faster than she'd thought possible. For a moment, real fear gripped her. She was 78 years old, carrying a child through a burning building. What had she been thinking? Then she heard something that made her want to cry with relief. The roar of motorcycle engines. Through the smoke and flames, she saw figures moving toward her. Big figures in leather vests, carrying fire extinguishers and what looked like emergency breathing masks. The Hells Angels had arrived. Raymond reached her first, pressing a mask over the little girl's face. We got you, Margaret. Follow me. Stay low. 2 other club members flanked them, using fire extinguishers to clear a path through the flames. They moved fast but carefully, making sure Margaret could keep up. Within 30 seconds, they were outside. Paramedics were rushing forward to take the little girl. Margaret collapsed onto the grass, coughing and gasping. Someone put an oxygen mask over her face, and the cool air felt like heaven. Through watering eyes, she saw at least 15 Hells Angels working alongside the firefighters. Helping to evacuate the building and fight the flames, the fire chief stood nearby, looking stunned. How did you guys get here so fast? We monitor emergency channels, Raymond explained, still catching his breath. We were 20 miles out when we heard about the fire. Figured the town might need help. That woman went into a burning building, one of the deputies said, pointing at Margaret. She could have died. She didn't, said a familiar voice. Eleanor from the book club was standing there, tears streaming down her face. She saved that little girl. That's Annie Rodriguez. She's in my granddaughter's class. More people were gathering now. Parents who'd gotten their children back safely. Teachers who'd managed to evacuate everyone. They all watched as the Hells Angels continued to work, helping however they could, not asking for thanks or recognition. The fire was finally contained after another hour. The gym was destroyed, and the East Wing had significant damage, but the rest of the school was salvageable. And most importantly, every single child was safe. Margaret was sitting in the back of an ambulance, being checked over by paramedics, when little Annie's mother rushed up. You saved my baby, she sobbed, grabbing Margaret's hands. You went in there and brought her out? How can I ever thank you? I just did what needed doing, Margaret said quietly. But her voice was rough from the smoke. Sheriff Bradley approached. And for once, he wasn't wearing his stern expression. Margaret, that was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. You could have died in there. But she didn't, Raymond said, appearing beside them. He was covered in soot and ash, his leather vest singed in places. And neither did that little girl. Sometimes brave and foolish are the same thing. The sheriff looked at Raymond for a long moment. Then slowly, he extended his hand. Thank you for helping. We couldn't have controlled that fire so quickly without your crew. Raymond shook his hand firmly. We're part of this community now. Whether folks like it or not, when there's trouble, we show up. That's what we do. By evening, the story had spread through Millbrook faster than the fire itself. Margaret Henderson, the woman everyone had shunned for helping the Hells Angels, had run into a burning building to save a child. And the Hells Angels, the dangerous bikers everyone feared, had helped fight the fire and rescue both Margaret and the little girl. The video from the school's security cameras made the news that night. You could see Margaret running into the building. You could see the bikers arriving and rushing in to help. You could see the moment they emerged with Margaret and Annie, working together to save lives. The comment section on the news website exploded. These are the people you were afraid of? One person wrote. They dropped everything to help save a school. Another said, maybe it's time Millbrook learned what real character looks like. Margaret went home that night, exhausted, her lungs still burning slightly from the smoke. Her daughter wanted her to stay at the hospital overnight for observation, but Margaret refused. She just wanted her own bed and some peace and quiet, but as she pulled up to her house, she saw something that made her pause. Her front porch was covered in flowers. Dozens of bouquets, cards, handmade thank you notes from children. Mrs. Chen, from across the street, was sitting on the porch steps, waiting for her. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Chen said as Margaret approached. I called the police on those bikers when they came to honor you. I thought they were here to cause trouble. But they weren't, were they? They were here to pay respects to someone who deserves it. And I've been awful to you. I'm so sorry. Margaret sat down on the steps beside her, too tired to stand anymore. It's all right, Helen. People get scared of what they don't understand. You could have died today, Mrs. Chen said, tears in her eyes. You and those bikers could have died saving our children. And I've spent the last month treating you like you did something wrong. What kind of person does that make me? The kind of person who can learn and grow, Margaret said gently. That's all any of us can do. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set over Millbrook, and for the first time in weeks, Margaret felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. 3 months after the fire, Millbrook looked different. Not physically, though the school was being rebuilt with better materials and a modern heating system. No, the difference was in the people. In the way they treated each other, in the way they saw the world. Margaret noticed it first on her morning walks, which she'd resumed along County Road 12. People didn't just wave anymore. They stopped to chat. They asked how she was feeling, whether her lungs had fully recovered from the smoke. Old Walter, who'd grabbed his walking stick like a weapon when the bikers first showed up, now invited her for coffee every Thursday morning. But the biggest change was at Murphy's Bar, the same place where the trouble had started 3 years ago. The owner, a gruff man named Patrick, who'd sworn he'd never let another biker through his door, had done something unexpected. He'd invited the Hells Angels to hold their monthly meeting there. They saved our kids, Patrick explained to anyone who questioned his decision. They ran into danger when they didn't have to. That earns them a place at my bar any day of the week. The first meeting drew curious onlookers from all over town. People expected trouble, or at the very least some uncomfortable tension. What they got instead was the Hells Angels ordering burgers, playing pool, and chatting with locals about everything from motorcycle maintenance to the best fishing spots in the county. The young biker with the daughter, whose name Margaret had learned was Trevor, became a regular fixture in town. His leg had healed well, though he still walked with a slight limp. He'd found work at the auto repair shop on 3rd Street, and the owner, Mr. Patterson, couldn't stop praising his skills with engines. Best mechanic I've had in 20 years, Mr. Patterson told everyone who'd listen, and he's teaching my son things about motorcycles I never knew existed. Trevor brought his daughter Lily to town on weekends. She was a bright, cheerful 6-year-old who loved butterflies, just like he'd said. Margaret saw them at the library one Saturday, and Lily ran up to her with a drawing. My daddy says you're the guardian angel who saved his life, Lily said, holding up a picture she'd drawn of Margaret with actual wings. So I made you this. Margaret hung that drawing on her refrigerator, right next to the photos of her own grandchildren. Every time she looked at it, She remembered why she'd climbed down into that ditch in the first place. The older biker, Raymond's brother, whose name was Donald, took longer to recover. The internal injuries had been severe, and he'd spent weeks in physical therapy just learning to walk properly again. But he was determined, and by December, he was back on his motorcycle, riding carefully, but riding nonetheless. He started something that surprised everyone, including Margaret: a motorcycle safety course for teenagers. Every Saturday afternoon, he taught kids at the high school about road safety, defensive driving, and how to respect the power of a motorcycle. The police department endorsed it. The school board approved it, and parents signed their kids up in droves. "If my boy's going to ride someday, I want him learning from someone who knows what they're doing," one father said at a town council meeting. "And I want him learning from someone who understands that one mistake can cost you everything." Sheriff Bradley attended one of the classes just to observe. He watched Donald patiently explain how to check tire pressure, how to watch for road hazards, how one moment of carelessness could lead to disaster. Afterward, he pulled Donald aside. "I was wrong about you," the sheriff said simply. "I was wrong about all of you. I let one bad incident color my view of an entire group of people. That's not the kind of lawman I want to be." "We all make mistakes," Donald replied. "The important thing is learning from them. You're doing that? So is this town." The real test of how much Millbrook had changed came in early January. The elementary school rebuild had hit a major snag. The insurance company was dragging its feet. The school board was short nearly $50,000 for the new gymnasium. Without it, kids would be bused to the next town over for PE classes, which meant longer days and stressed parents. Raymond called Margaret one evening. "We want to help with the school," he said. "We're thinking of organizing a fundraiser. A concert, maybe, or a motorcycle rally. But we wanted to run it by you first. Make sure the town would be okay with it." Margaret smiled. "Raymond, you don't need my permission. But I think it's a wonderful idea. We need your help, though," he continued. "You know this town. You know how to bring people together. We're good at riding motorcycles and fixing engines, but organizing a whole town, that's your specialty." So Margaret became the bridge between the Hells Angels and Millbrook. She helped them organize what would become the biggest event the town had ever seen: a 2-day motorcycle rally and music festival. With all proceeds going to the school, the planning meetings were held at the library, and they drew an interesting crowd. Raymond and his club members sat at the same table as Pastor Williams from First Baptist. Eleanor from the book club worked alongside Trevor to coordinate food vendors. Mrs. Chen designed flyers with help from Donald, who turned out to have a talent for graphic design. "A year ago, I never would have believed this," Eleanor said during one meeting. Looking around at the diverse group working together, us, working side by side with the Hells Angels like it's the most natural thing in the world. "Maybe it should be the most natural thing in the world," Margaret suggested quietly. "Working together, helping each other. Seeing past our differences to what really matters." The rally took place on a perfect Saturday in March. Over 500 motorcycles rolled into Millbrook, coming from 6 different states. Local businesses set up booths. 3 bands played on a stage built in the town square. Children ran around with their faces painted, eating cotton candy, and admiring the motorcycles lined up on Main Street. Margaret walked through the crowds, marveling at what she saw. Patrick from Murphy's Bar was teaching a Hells Angel how to pull a proper draft beer. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daughter Annie had been saved from the fire, was taking photos of her family standing next to Raymond's motorcycle. Sheriff Bradley was actually laughing with a group of bikers, swapping stories about the craziest calls he'd responded to over the years. The rally raised $73,000. Not only enough for the gymnasium, but enough to update the school's entire fire safety system and add a library wing at the closing ceremony. The mayor asked Margaret to say a few words. She stood on that stage, looking out at the crowd of townspeople and bikers all mixed together, and felt emotion welling up in her chest. 4 months ago, she began, her voice carrying across the square, I climbed down into a ditch and helped 2 injured men. I didn't think about who they were or what they represented. I just saw 2 human beings who needed help. And that simple act, that one decision to show compassion instead of fear, changed everything. She paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. But I didn't change this town alone. Every person here had to make their own choice. To look past their prejudices. To give people a second chance. To realize that the patches on someone's jacket don't tell you who they are on the inside. Trevor was standing near the front with Lily on his shoulders. Donald was there with his physical therapy cane, standing straighter than he had in months. Raymond stood beside Sheriff Bradley, and if you didn't know better, you'd think they'd been friends for years. This town taught me something important, Margaret continued. It's never too late to change. It's never too late to admit you were wrong, to open your heart, to see people as they really are instead of as you feared they might be. Millbrook is stronger now because we learned to see past the leather and the logos and the reputations. We learned to see each other as neighbors, as friends, as family. The applause that followed was deafening. But what Margaret remembered most was what happened after she stepped off that stage. Little Lily broke free from her father and ran up to Margaret, wrapping her small arms around Margaret's legs. "Thank you for saving my daddy," she whispered. "He says I almost didn't have a daddy anymore. But you made sure I got to keep him." Margaret knelt down, ignoring her protesting knees, and hugged the little girl properly. "Sweetie, your daddy's a fighter. He would have made it back to you no matter what. I just helped him along the way." But she knew that wasn't entirely true. Those extra 10 minutes, that tourniquet, that decision to act instead of waiting, that had made all the difference. Just like one person's decision to show compassion instead of fear had made all the difference for an entire town. That evening, as the motorcycles began to leave Millbrook, Raymond stopped by Margaret's house one last time. "We'll be back next year for another rally," he said. "If that's okay with you and the town. I think the town would be disappointed if you didn't come back." Margaret replied with a smile. Raymond looked at her for a moment. This elderly woman who'd changed so many lives with one act of kindness. You know what the amazing thing is? You still don't see yourself as special. You still think you just did what anyone would do? Isn't that what anyone should do? Margaret asked. Help when help is needed? Should, yes, Raymond agreed. But most people don't. Most people let fear stop them. You didn't, and that made all the difference. Not just for my brother and nephew, but for all of us. You showed this town what